Hello, today we are going to discuss on why South China Sea's choke point shape the global trade and the geopolitical risk. The South China Sea is not just a regional waterway, it is one of the most important trade corridors in the world. Every year, more than half of the global trade by value moves by sea, and many of those routes pass through the narrow maritime choke points. These choke points are like highways squeezed into narrow gates. When they work smoothly, global trade looks normal. But if one of them is disrupted, the impact can spread across the energy market, manufacturing supply chains, shipping costs, and even the national security. The stakes are especially high in the South China Sea because the Malacca Strait and the Taiwan Strait each handle trillions of dollars of goods every year. In 2024, eight major South China Sea straits collectively handled nearly 6.4 trillion in goods, while the Malacca and Taiwan each handled more than 2.4 trillion US dollars. So the big idea is simple. If these straits are stable, global trade flows. If they are disrupted, the shock does not stay local. It can affect the entire world. This slide shows why the South China Sea should be seen as a global trade superhighway. There are eight key straits in this region: Malacca, Taiwan, Sunda, Luzon, Mindoro, Makassar, Balabac, and Lombok. But the data shows that two of them dominate the system: the Malacca Strait and the Taiwan Strait. In 2024, the Malacca Strait carried about 2.459 trillions in goods, and the Taiwan Strait carried about 2.4 trillion goods. Each one accounted for roughly 21% of the global maritime trade. The other straits are still important, but they are much smaller by comparison. This matters because many discussions focus mainly on Malacca, but the Taiwan Strait is almost equally important in total trade value. So when the policymakers think about the maritime risk in Asia, they cannot look at Malacca Strait alone. They have to look at the Taiwan Strait as well. They need to understand the entire choke point network. There are many ways in which trade through these waterways can be disrupted. The biggest risk is conflict over Taiwan. A blockade, invasion, or quarantine could turn the Taiwan Strait into a dangerous zone and could also affect the nearby Luzon Strait. A conflict inside the South China Sea could also spread across the region and affect both major and secondary straits. But war is not the only risk. We also need to look at the state intervention, piracy, terrorism, accidents, and environmental disasters. For example, piracy and armed robbery in the Malacca and Singapore Strait has reached around 108 accidents in 2025, a 74% increase from the previous year. If a route is blocked, ships can sometimes go around it, but rerouting is expensive. A tanker may have to use the Sunda Strait, then the Lombok and Makassar, or in the worst case, go all the way around the Australia. That can add days or even weeks of travel time. During the Red Sea crisis, some voyages from Europe to Arabian Sea stretched from 19 days to 34 days. So disruption is not just about ships being delayed. It means higher fuel cost, higher insurance cost, tightening shipper capacity, and eventually higher prices for businesses and consumers. China has long worried about what is called as the Malacca dilemma. This means China fears that its energy and trade could be blocked at the Malacca Strait. But China may actually face an even bigger Taiwan Strait dilemma. In 2024, nearly 963 billion US dollars of China's trade passed through the Malacca Strait. That included about 21% of the China's import and 14% of its export. But nearly 1.3 trillion US dollars of Chinese trade passed through the Taiwan Strait, about 33% more than that of Malacca. The Taiwan Strait is also important for China's own domestic shipping. Goods made in southern hubs like Shenzhen and Guangzhou often move by sea toward the eastern and the northern ports like Shanghai, Ningbo, and Tianjin. If the sea route is disrupted, goods could move by road or rail, but that would be far more expensive. Moving goods by road from Guangzhou to Tianjin can cost about three times as much as mo- moving them by sea. So, a Taiwan crisis could not only hurt Taiwan or foreign trade, it could also damage China's own import, exports, and internal logistic network. The United States is also exposed to the South China Sea, but not as heavily as its Asian allies. Only 3 to 4% of the total US trade moved through the Luzon, Malacca, and Taiwan Straits each in 2024. That means the US has exposure, but it is relatively limited and spread across the global routes. But for the US allies and partners in Asia, the picture is very different. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines collectively shipped around 755 billion US dollars through the Taiwan Strait and 474 billion US dollars through the Malacca Strait in 2024. Japan is especially dependent. Around 28% of the Japan's total trade passed through the Taiwan Strait and 18% through Malacca. South Korea dependent on the Taiwan Strait for 22% of its trade and Malacca for 13%. This is why a Taiwan Strait or South China Sea crisis is not only a military issue. For countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines, it is also an energy security issue, a technology supply chain issue, and an economic survival issue. Oceania countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island economies are different from most countries in this story. Most economies rely mainly on either Malacca or Taiwan, but Australia's most important South China Sea choke point is actually the Mindoro Strait. In 2024, Mindoro carried 34% of Australia's export and 26% of its import. For Australia, the Taiwan Strait ranked second, while the Malacca Strait ranked only by fourth. This is because Australia is a major exporter of commodities such as iron ore, LNG oil, and coal. These exports often move from Australia towards China, Japan, and South Korea through different southern and eastern routes. The Australian exports accounted for 88% of all trade through the Lombok Strait, 60% through the Makassar Strait, and 44% through the Mindoro Strait. New Zealand and Pacific Island economies also rely heavily on routes through the Luzon Strait. Around 16% of the New Zealand's total trade and 41% of the Solomon Islands trade passed through Luzon in 2024. So, Oceania shows a important lesson. Not every country depends on the same choke point. Geography changes the risk. Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific have a different choke point, while South Korea, Japan, and Philippines have a different choke point. So, the South China Sea choke point matter far beyond Asia. Many of the most exposed countries are in the global south, especially in Africa and the Middle East. This is because East and Southeast Asia need huge amount of energy and industrial inputs, and many of those supplies comes from resource-rich countries far away. For example, six Persian Gulf exporters Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq relied on the Malacca Strait for at least 40% of their exports in 2024. In Africa, Eritrea was the world's most reliant country on Malacca. 90% of its export and 70% of the total trade passed through it. Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya each received more than 40% of imports through Malacca. But there are exceptions. The Democratic Republic of Congo relies much less on Malacca because much of its trade moves through the Sunda and the Taiwan Strait instead. So the conclusion is clear. Malacca slightly leads Taiwan in the total trade value, but Taiwan is more important for China, Taiwan itself, and the several US allies. The bigger policy lesson is that government should not rely only on the headline numbers. They need the choke point level data to understand which country is vulnerable through which route and why. Thank you.